All right. So my name is Catherine Thomason, and I am um, the lobby coordinator for MCAT, which stands for Mobilizing Climate Action Together, one of the co-hosts, as well as working with the State Environmental Caucus of the Democrats. Um, as you can see from the slide, we have a number of co-hosts. Um, and a lot of other interested groups that have put this notice out for people to join us across the state. And we do have people from Eastern and Southern and coastal Oregon. So welcome to everybody. Um, for those of you who were here on our first presentation on water, we went into some of the issues around water and the scarcity, particularly in Eastern Oregon, as well as possible worries and concerns about whether or not we have enough for people to use, both for personal use as well as agriculture, as well as what happens to the water when it's wastewater. Is it being handled properly? So we won't go into those issues this evening. We also plan to have a third webinar, the final one, in June on electricity and power use, as well as the air pollution that can come from using backup generation. And today's focus is land use and economic impact of data centers in Oregon. Um, and I'm trying to advance the slides. And I don't know what that pin is. Um,
There you go, Catherine.
oh, you did it. Great.
No, I didn't.
It just went.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So the agenda this evening is I'll be giving a very short introduction. We have two people speaking on land use
Okay.
from different aspects.
Hey, baby.
Um, Ben Gordon from Central Oregon Land Watch, and Nellie McAdams, and then moving into tax policy and economic impacts. I will introduce each of those as we move forward. So just by definition, a data center is basically a warehouse collection of computers for building, running, and delivering applications and services. The data centers that were built in the 1990s were typically company owned and operated with more lower industrial amounts of power usage in the range of 100 kilowatts to up to a megawatt. They typically used air conditioning for cooling, which is costly. In the 2000s, a new brand of data centers was created called multi-tenant data centers. And they would lease out space for companies to use and maintain and manage those computers and basically these racks of computers for the companies. And they became more efficient. They could cool either by using cooling water, but the amount of power per unit was about in the more of the tens of megawatts. In the 2010s, cloud computing became an issue, and in this in that scenario, the size is becoming much, much larger. The capital to build these was much greater. The amount of power needed was in the hundreds of megawatts or more. And now we have something called hyperscale AI data centers, which can be sited on hundreds of acres, extremely high capital expenses with very, very large power consumption. In other parts of the state, they're building their own power generation, which we don't typically allow here in Oregon. And there is one scheduled in being worked on to be sited here in Oregon. Just to give you a sense, this data comes from two different sources, the Go Data Centers link, and then there's a link on the bottom of the page that you'll see when you get the slides. We probably have more than 138 data centers already, but even at 138, we are third in the world for number of data centers after Virginia and Beijing. The locations are high in the Hillsborough area, in Boardman, Hermiston, and Umatilla. Many or most of them Amazon. 13 in Prineville, 2 in Bend, all Meta and Apple. The Dalles has 6, all Google, with another one already planned and cited. So we are just galloping along with data centers. And there are concerns around it, which is why we're doing this series of webinars. And one of the concerns is the land being used wisely? And what are some of the land use issues around that? So we're going to lead off with I think these got with Ben Gordon from the Central Oregon Land Watch that he's led since 2020, providing vision and strategic leadership as the organization has evolved to meet the demands of a fast-growing region. Prior to joining Land Watch, Ben has had roles throughout Oregon's environmental nonprofit ecosystem. He actually taught forest ecology for the Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center, served as community organizer for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters and 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and then as program director for the Oregon Natural Desert Association. So Ben, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Catherine. It's great to be with so many folks tonight. Catherine mentioned my organization, Central Oregon Land Watch. We are a place-based environmental watchdog and advocacy organization. We work at the intersection of urban planning, farm and forest land preservation, federal forest management and oversight, and river advocacy in the Deschutes River Basin. Our core geography is what we think of as Central Oregon, Deschutes, Crook, and Jefferson counties. And data centers are one of those issues that they really light up across our core programs and priorities because of their implications for power consumption, water usage, uh, large land demands, and how and where they are sited. There are a lot of considerations for wildlife habitat and the despoiling of habitats that are, may or may not be needed for these industrial uses. And one of our strong tools is the land use planning program, realizing that folks on this webinar may have differing levels of familiarity with the program. And I'll just give a really high level overview and hope that is helpful for framing this conversation. Um, so the Oregon Land Use Planning Program has been around for more than 50 years, and at its heart, it's a commitment to protect our irreplaceable farm and forest land and thoughtfully site our cities and towns through a process called urban growth boundary expansions. There's a lot more to them, but for the purposes of the talk that I'm going to give tonight, there's a real difference when it comes to the siting of data centers if we're going to site them, whether they're within the urban growth boundaries in the already urbanized areas and interface, or if we're talking about converting unurbanized lands, typically zoned farm and forest. Um, Let me take a quick look at my notes here. So when we talk about prosperity for Oregon in the context of data centers, being from Central Oregon and having Prineville in my backyard as an example, while there's a lot of enthusiasm for data centers' ability to create jobs, we're seeing that the original estimates for job creation are quickly dwindling, especially as AI replaces humans in the workforce. So just the other week, there was an announcement that Meta was going to slash 10% of its workforce in Prineville. And so these hopes that they're going to be these major job creations are being called into question, especially as AI is evolving. And then there are the, other taxation issues, which I know we'll get into later in this webinar. But there's this kind of a hopeful enthusiasm that this is sort of a panacea or a silver bullet for communities that are in need of these economic drivers. And while that is true to varying extents, it's important to also weigh the consequences. You're going after one economic driver, and what is the potential downside to that? We're learning about this as we're learning about data centers as neighbors in our backyards. But we also need to be thinking about the trade-offs. So, Oregon, as someone who grew up somewhere else, I grew up in Maryland. I saw it rapidly convert from a place that had beautiful farms and rolling green hills and forest land to, literally a new city overnight. That happened many times in my 17 years in Maryland. So coming out to Oregon and appreciating its splendor and what makes it so special to live here, if we're not carefully safeguarding that, big developments like data centers could quickly gobble up our view shed, our open space, our wildlife habitats, the essence of what makes Oregon such a special place to live. So, really trying to avoid the unintended effects of sprawl, and also with regard to that sprawl, the lasting public costs, building outside of urban growth boundaries where there aren't, where infrastructure isn't already, the cost to connect and the cost to maintain become astronomical over time. Catherine, if you're controlling the slides, could you go to the next one? Thank you so much. So from the planning perspective, I thought I could just kind of share a little bit about what we're seeing in Central Oregon and then link it to this context of the land use planning program, which I gave this, kind of very high level, and get into a little bit of the specificity that we've started to realize may need rethinking as it pertains to data centers because they are this unique consumer of so many resources. So I mentioned Prineville. Prineville already has its data center campuses, Meta and Apple. And Prineville is interested in having more large campuses to attract more data center business. We're seeing this as well in Madras. Madras recently went through a process to bring in more large lot industrial lands, presumably for data centers. Currently, I noticed that Darren is on the webinar from Lapine. Lapine is in the process of considering a data center within its urban growth boundary. And so, sort of from my perspective, throughout the geography where I live and work, we're seeing um, ready examples of land use processes to establish more um, industrial land. And it is obvious that the intention is to recruit more data center businesses. So, from the standpoint of land use, what we've realized is both within the urban growth boundaries and outside of them, those lands are managed by different jurisdictions. Within, it's a city council, and outside, there are boards of county commissioners, and they have different mechanisms for establishing additional industrial land. So, I'll start with within the urban growth boundary. And while in a lot of ways, if we're going to have data centers, it makes most sense to site them within the urban growth boundary because that is where the urban uses already are. That's where the infrastructure is. Those are lands that we've already committed to urbanizing them. So there's a mechanism called an EOA, economic opportunity analysis. When a city looks at its industrial lands within its urban growth boundary, and it feels that it doesn't have the right industrial lands or the right amount of industrial land, it can conduct this economic opportunity analysis to more or less determine if there is a segment of the economy it wants to attract, but it feels that its industrial lands are insufficient for attracting that industry. And that essentially going through that process, which is really biased toward the city's opinion, it then opens up a skinny urban growth boundary expansion specifically for more industrial land. So we're seeing that in Prineville right now. And once land is set aside as industrial for industrial uses, it becomes very hard to slow the momentum towards data centers. Um, that is it's a big challenge and it's worrisome, but I think as we get into further into my talk, but also the governor's advisory council and what's likely to be discussed in the 2027 legislative session, I think that's a necessary conversation for us to be having. So stronger guardrails, which I'll get into later. So that's on the urban side and this economic opportunity analysis, which kicks off a skinny urban growth boundary expansion for more industrial land. It just seems it's very easy when a city is motivated to bring in industrial land, especially for data centers, to be able to do it. So the mechanism is relatively easy to use. And then on the rural land side, on the county side, counties have to manage all of the private land under their purview under a comprehensive plan. And that's tied to this land use planning program, which at the state level, there are these 19 overarching goals. And the state gives local discretion, and the local municipality has to define through their comprehensive plan how they're going to meet the aims of these 19 goals. Um, and so, as they set up their comprehensive plans, they're to be a kind of a guiding document. It's their commitments to how they're going to meet the expectation of land use program for 30 years. And there's a mechanism within a comp plan where you can set aside lands, you can essentially zone them as industrial, and you can look at lands like your farm and your forest lands if you feel you have enough of them, but you don't have enough of lands for other uses or needs, in this case, industrial, and you can set aside through a rezoning process a goal exception and basically establish more industrial lands. And we've seen that in the Umatilla Basin. There's some examples of that where the soon to be 1,300-acre Amazon data center campus is sited on lands that were farmland and were converted for industrial use through a goal exception within the county's comprehensive plan. So that's another mechanism that is seemingly there's a lot of local um, say and discretion, and just another place where, as we think about the broader implications of data centers, we should take a look at that as well. Something about these data centers is that they kind of require this perfect combination of they require large lots of amounts of land, they consume a lot of energy, they need a reliable long-term water supply, and they need access to the transmission and fiber. So in some regards, those all of those things lining up in one place, there aren't a lot of spots in Oregon where that all comes together. So its potential to for us to chase the perfect locations at the expense of other priorities is a real risk to Oregon and how we manage land through our land use program. Catherine, if you go to next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned some of this in my earlier remarks, but we're not wholly against data centers. And when Catherine shared the history of data centers, the size of them, how consumptive they are, I do think it's important to differentiate that the hyper and the exascales and the really big consumers, they need a specific framework that is comprehensive. So we have some principal concerns, especially about them and about any data centers that are going to be sited kind of on the margins outside of our cities and towns. So we would be concerned about the conversion of a high value farm and forest land. That's kind of an irreversible change once it happens. Certainly need to be considering wildlife habitats. Um, these data centers, there are instances where they're sort of exempt from environmental review and land use. While Oregon doesn't have a statewide environmental protection like a SEPA or a CEQA in SEPA in Washington, CEQA in California. We have land use and we have other protections, but what I've noticed is land use is the pointy end of the spear, and once the land use application is approved, then all the other agencies and all of the other environmental considerations, you got these agencies trying to figure out how to get to yes. So once this one is done, it opens the door to most of the others. And there are certainly still review processes, but they become much easier to meet thresholds once land use is done. So it is the pointy end of the spear and something that we need to really evaluate as we think about data centers because of their consumption as fairly more or less a novel use here in the state. Urban growth boundary expansions that are driven by market preference rather than demonstrated public need. That's back to the economic opportunity analyses that I mentioned. If a local municipality feels it wants to go after a new industry, it's pretty easy for it to justify that it needs more industrial land for that. Um, Catherine, next slide, please. Thank you. So, policy guardrails, and Catherine's going to summarize all of the sort of recommendations for how we think about managing the data center industry towards the end. But we we have choices here. If we're going to have data centers, it is really in our control to choose where they're sited, and how impactful they are. So siting requirements, especially within urban growth boundaries, there are lots of places in the state that would be great candidates that aren't despoiling current farm and forest in their still natural states. Um, Efficiency first standard. So with regard to existing lands being used first, but also evaluated where possible. Could we reconfigure them, right? So industrial lands, I mentioned before that if a city wants more industrial land, it doesn't have to give anything back. It can sort of double take if it wants to, because maybe the acres they have aren't of the right configuration to attract the right potential business client or new business to the area. I think we really need to consider if that's the best approach because once land is brought in for industrial use, it's never going back. So right now you can just add indefinitely, and there is no subtracting. I think that's a real consideration that we need to think through. We need, especially for those bigger data centers, cumulative accounting of the water use, the energy demand, the infrastructure costs. And we need to think about those things, not just in the money, the jobs, the tax incentives they create, but also the expenses to carry those businesses in the long run because they are significant. We know that for those larger data centers, it's not just about land use. It needs to be a comprehensive review. So it's sort of like nothing gets approved unless everything gets approved. The local decision making is something that we just need to think through because these decisions we're making now they have such great implications for the long-term health of our communities and our environment here in Oregon. And I think it's important that we have strong agreements between local communities, and these businesses to make sure that if they're going to be sited here in Oregon, that they're of mutual benefit. Next slide, please, Catherine. Okay, I think that's the end of my presentation. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate you tuning in. I'm gonna hand it over to Nellie McAdams, the Executive Director of the Oregon Agricultural Trust. Catherine, do you want to introduce Nellie like you introduced me?
I'm realizing once I put myself on mute that I can't share the screen. Um, Hi, Nellie. I'm glad you were able to be part of this presentation tonight. Nellie is the executive director of the Oregon Agricultural Trust. She grew up farming alongside her parents as a third generation on her family's Gaston, Oregon hazelnut farm. She is also an attorney and longtime advocate for farm succession planning and farmland preservation. As Oregon Agricultural Trust founding executive director, she's dedicated to working together to keep Oregon a great place to farm and live. So we'll pull up the slides again.
Would you mind making me a co-host, Catherine? I have a lot of them. I have some animations in them. It might be easiest if I'm able to advance them myself.
Sure.
Thank you. Um, while Catherine's getting my slides pulled up, it's great to see a lot of folks I know on this call. Uh, I've been giving a couple of these presentations so far, so apologize if you've heard some of the things I'm saying already. Thank you for making me co-host. Look, that worked. Um, I'm going to be talking about a couple of data center facts, so just picking up a couple that Catherine didn't mention at the top that I saw in the questions people included in their RSVPs. And then I'll dig into the most recent requests for land that the state has been seeing and the volume of those requests. I'll also be talking about a couple examples and what this massive call for agricultural land to be brought into cities is doing to entire agricultural regions and also to good governance. We'll talk about some of the lack of transparency and, in fact, some of the corruption that has been discovered around data centers. And Catherine, you're welcome to. Oh, I can. Okay, I'll share my slides then.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yes. Um. So just getting my slideshow view. All right. And then we'll talk about a couple of policy options that are out there as well. So, first, as Catherine mentioned, there are a lot of data centers here. 138 was the number in December, as I put into chat. Although today it says 123. That's because those reporting on the number of data centers decided to consolidate some of the multi-data center facilities in Morrow County, in part. We're also, as of late last year, about third in the world by electrical power consumed by IT equipment. So just a huge electrical load. And that's right behind Virginia, which is number one, and then Beijing. Folks had asked about jobs, and it's difficult to find good numbers, especially because the newer hyperscale AI data centers have fewer and fewer jobs. But there are a few jobs associated with data centers, primarily their construction. Sometimes we've seen when folks report the number of jobs associated with data centers, they count the construction jobs as anew every year. So they say we have 100 construction jobs this year, 100 construction jobs next year, and then, zero point 0.5 permanent jobs. So there's some funny math that is happening with the job counts. But some of those larger uh, data centers have as few as 0.25 permanent jobs per acre, which is extraordinarily low. They're primarily janitorial jobs and so low wage. And then you'll be hearing about tax policy later, but in order to qualify for an enterprise zone property tax credit, these businesses just need to show that the wage that they're paying is between 102% and 125% of minimum wage. So also extremely low impact for those workers and for income taxes. When we look at the number of jobs that are generated per state and federal or government investment, in Virginia, at least, we found that in the last 5 years, it yielded one direct permanent job for every 54 million that was invested. It's about 168 times more than what it costs to create a non-data center job. There are also considerable harms to communities and the environment. This can be for other webinars, but that includes water and air pollution. The water that is used in data centers for cooling often has many chemicals, including PFAS in them. And there have been sizable amounts of PFAS found downstream of data centers in Washington County. And no reporting requirements and filtration and reporting on the filtration as well. We're also concerned about air pollution because many of these data centers have diesel generators that are often powered day long. The battery storage sites that they have are often hazardous, some containing lithium, and it can be almost impossible. Well, it's not possible to put out a fire on these battery storage sites with water. You have to use other hazardous chemicals to put out those fires, and it can be extraordinarily dangerous for those involved. And then they use vast amounts of water and land is what I'm going to be focusing on. So at Department of Land Conservation and Development's March meeting, they announced hidden in the packet, but it was there, that they had about applications for urban growth boundary expansions of about 9,100 acres that is being planned for data centers currently. That could quadruple Oregon's current footprint. That would be data centers the size of the city of Springfield, shown in that map there. And includes the 1,300 exascale data center that's approved for Morrow County. And most of these data centers are located in Eastern Oregon, or most of these land expansions. Did I say Morrow County? I meant Eastern Oregon. So they're in rural areas. And some people might have heard about the 1-year moratorium on the use of enterprise zones in standard enterprise zones, so not rural enterprise zones. Most of these land expansions would be in the rural enterprise zone area, and so that moratorium does not apply to them at all. If anyone has been watching Washington County politics, it doesn't apply to Hillsborough either, because as Jody will tell you, they have been getting as many applications in as they can before the moratorium takes effect. And mysteriously, there was no emergency clause making that moratorium take effect immediately after the legislative session. There was 90 days to get those applications in. To back up a little bit, the Department of Land Conservation and Development says that the magnitude of urban growth boundary expansions for data center development is without modern precedent under the statewide land use planning program. There has never been so much land that has been called in at one time for any use. So what impacts does that have? As Ben was saying, the impacts of sprawl are in part due to how our economic opportunity analysis program is designed. So a city in that analysis can request land for any type of so-called economic development. The state doesn't have the right to judge whether that is good economic development or economic development that we want to incentivize or not. We also see multiple cities in neighboring areas requesting similar amounts of land because they think that they're going to land the white whale of a gigantic data center, whereas a neighboring city also thinks it will. And so we see multiple cities being able to justify a huge land expanse for a use that might only land at one of those cities. But once that lands in, it never's coming out. And so we have a lack of regional planning. We have statewide planning, we have city planning, but we have a lack of regional planning outside of Metro, the Rogue Valley in one instance, and some other small instances. But we are seeing many cities going for a gold rush of land. If that land is not turned into a data center, that land might be turned into anything, warehouses, commercial, nothing, but the city will have spent a lot of money in planning for that. We also see increased renewable energy demand. You saw that Oregon was number 3 in terms of the energy demand of the data center industry in the world. And we also have climate goals that are based on a percentage of our total energy that's going to be provided by renewables. So the higher the amount of energy that we use, the higher the amount of energy that needs to be fulfilled through that percentage quota. And so we're seeing a lot more demand for solar, wind, and other extremely land extensive renewable energy purposes. And it's important to know that these sites are not going on vacant land. There is no vacant land. That land is either being used for a state's second largest industry of ranching, or it's being used for habitat. And these sites have fences up around them because they don't want animals there. And we see it being highly disruptive to migratory corridors and wildlife habitat, especially the solar. And then these impacts on the land lead to land speculation and folks who are trying to make it rich by selling their land instead of at farm prices for industrials and specifically data center prices. So I'm going to be talking about Washington County in particular. Land there for agricultural use is about 20,000 an acre. And then for data center use, it's recently been selling for 1.2 million per acre. That's a huge differential. And landowners who are at the edge of Hillsborough have been trying for at least a dozen years, but more than that, to bring their land into the city, really for any purpose. They've made pitches for housing, for semiconductor factories, but more recently for data center purposes. And we saw that most recently in Senate Bill 1586 in this last legislative session. But they are also trying, there are folks outside of Metro, outside of Hillsborough, in the city of North Plains, who are also attempting to bring some of the best farmland in the world into that city's limits, primarily for data center and warehouse industries. All of that land is prime farmland of special, almost all of it, of special significance. And it is some of the last best of the best. The best farmland in Oregon, some of the best farmland that was ever in the world up until that time, is under the city of Portland, Eugene, and Springfield. So we've already lost some of the best, but what remains is at play here in this data center land grab. Facilitating that is a lobbyist who has a consulting contract, a lobbying contract with the landowners, where he would get a 15% cut of their increased property value if he's successful at lobbying to bring that land into the urban growth boundary or urban reserve. You know, just back of napkin, conservative estimate, if that land increases from 20,000 in ag value to 750,000 in industrial value, that's a $730,000 increase per acre. Multiply that by the commission, you get the lobbyist commission, you get about 110,000 that he would make per acre. And you assume that most of those acres are under contract. That's about 164 million that he would be receiving on contract if he's successful at bringing that land into the urban growth boundary. This contract is illegal. Contingency lobbying contracts in the state are illegal. I have been trying to get the Department of Justice to take notice. He does have 2 recorded land transactions, just so that you know that this is a thing that happens, not just in data centers, but for low density, sprawling residential development as well. And in one instance, he received $1,400 for a 10%. He paid $1,400 for a 10% share of land outside of an urban growth boundary in 1 year. The subsequent year, after it was brought into the urban growth boundary, he sold that share and made probably about $400,000. Now, Hillsborough has been claiming that this land that these landowners have been trying to bring into the urban growth boundary would be a major boon and a tech park. Most recently, they said it would be used for advanced manufacturing. They did not disclose that in August of last year, advanced manufacturing, the definition was changed to incorporate data centers. So this bill was very cleverly hiding the fact that a lot of that land would be going towards data centers. If you look at even Hillsborough's optimistic projections, they wouldn't expect to break even in 34 to 35 years, in which time data centers would probably be a totally different industry, and we'd still be holding the bag for that cost. So we very narrowly missed what would have been a huge suck of our tax dollars and resources for a windfall to a couple of landowners. I would just posit that this is not economic development. Our tax dollars are being used to cover the cost of an industry that's extremely profitable. In the case of data centers, you'll be hearing more about those incentives from Jody. But that industry provides little to no public benefit and harms our quality of life. There is right now, in addition to the Data Center Advisory Committee, a prosperity committee that is being managed by the state. If you have not attended a meeting of that body, that is understandable. Those meetings have not been open to the public. The members who seem to be very concentrated in very large businesses, trying to attract more large businesses instead of incentivizing our existing entrepreneurs and capitalizing on Oregon's strength, have just started to put out their recommendations. And I'm extremely concerned that a lot of the recommendations are going to be to promote industries such as data centers and to have a race to the bottom. So not all economic development is the same. It is not all created equal. And we need to think about who we're centering in economic development. It really should be the people of Oregon. Just briefly, Hillsborough's plan has been decades in the making. They have a nearly 6 foot pipe that is coming from the Willamette that's going to be coming online this year. They've bought about half the water rights from the city of Salem, and that could also be used for this industry. And we have just seen plan after plan that has been baking in a recipe for this expansion. We've also seen at the legislature numerous bills that are trying to bring in this land outside of the normal public process. So there have been 5 bills in just about as many years to bring this particular property into the urban growth boundary. Now, the city of North Plains was the city council was trying to do a similar expansion to grow that city by more than half of its size. It's the largest expansion by percentage size in Oregon history. But that was stopped by a referendum of the public. I'm not saying that is entirely stopped. There's a long battle when there are a lot of entrenched interests, but it is possible to stop this through a referendum in that case. I also want to talk about a very important case that has been elevated by the Oregonian and is now being taken up by Department of Justice, just showing what can happen when there's a lot of money at play, and how political officials need to be held accountable. And we need to be looking into how money is changing hands because it is whenever there's a lot of money involved, people are going to be creative. So, just to summarize, in Morrow County, there was a nonprofit corporation that was providing services, fiber optic services, to the government, to other nonprofits. They had a for-profit that was doing the same thing for businesses called WindWave. Inland was the overarching parent company. And their board, at one meeting, gave a $145,000 donation to a nonprofit organization in the county. That nonprofit organization had Representative Greg Smith as a contractor. That nonprofit has refused to say how that money was used, or whether Mr. Smith received that money. But at that meeting, Mr. Smith, as well as 2 others, were appointed to the board, and then 3 of the existing board members left. All right. So we have a new board made of 2 original board members and 3 new board members. And that new board received an offer to buy that for-profit company. That offer was for about $2.6 million, which was about a third of the actual value of that company. Now, the new board had not been soliciting open bids. This was the only one that they received. And the individuals who offered to buy WindWave, that fiber optic company, they consisted of 2 existing board members and the 3 board members who had just resigned. So they got a sweetheart deal in buying the nonprofit's most valuable asset. It's also interesting to note that some of them were elected officials in the county of Morrow. And these were not only elected officials, but they were elected officials who were involved in negotiating tax breaks to Amazon, which is the biggest data center operator in the county. So their main client, Amazon, gave them $100 million, or not gave, I shouldn't say gave. That money was through contracts, but it was extremely lucrative contracts with a company managed by elected officials who were at the same time negotiating for almost $500 million in tax breaks and land deals to Amazon. So here's a little summary. Those 4 local officials, they purchased WindWave. Amazon chose this firm over 14 rivals, and says that it hasn't admitted to knowing that the business members of WindWave were elected officials that it was also negotiating with. Amazon received $435 million in tax breaks. Those 3 of the public officials sometimes failed to disclose the conflict of interest when they were negotiating and deciding on those tax breaks to Amazon. They did receive a slap on the wrist, ethics penalties of $5,000 per person. By the time that this was disclosed, the statute of limitations had run on the criminal charges. So the Department of Justice is bringing claims on civil charges. That's a lot. I just encourage you to read Mike Rogaway's reporting in the Oregonian to learn more and to get updates on this. But basically, public officials in this case were making a lot of money privately while they were at the same time giving tax breaks to their biggest customer. I kind of like to end by soothing people and saying it's not your fault. Take all the pictures of your grandkids that you want, save them. There, most of the AI of the data center usage is increasingly for generative AI, also for crypto mining and other uses. And so your database is probably a very, very minimal amount of these data centers. But that generative AI demand is increasing. And I would say too that a lot of people, especially data center lobbyists, blame individuals by saying, well, if you like LinkedIn, if you like Facebook, then you're part of the problem. It's very similar to the advertising campaign that was launched by manufacturers who were introducing single-use plastics and planned obsolescence, so trying to get us to consume cheaper things more often, by shaming us for littering and polluting with the single-use plastics that they were putting into stores. So it's a similar marketing tactic, and I urge you to not be discouraged by that. It also doesn't have to be this way. The tech industry evolves rapidly. We know that because computers used to take up a space the size of your home, and now they can fit in your pocket. Data centers will also likely see that kind of evolution, and they're already seeing it. And if they aren't, then why aren't we not investing in that kind of efficiency? They Elon Musk has talked about putting them in outer space. That is what it is. But at least we can be stacking them higher. We can be using vacant buildings. Portland has a 40% commercial vacancy. We have the highest vacancy of industrial land in the metro area in 15 years. Those sites can be used for data centers. And then here are some recommendations regarding siting. So local municipalities and bodies of government can prohibit data center siting. That is code that you can develop and implement. You can defend urban growth boundaries at all times, not just for data centers, but also for really foolish uses that disregard the thousands of acres that we have within our urban growth boundaries for housing, industrial, and other purposes. We should be prohibiting data center construction on prime farmland, requiring increased stacking, and using existing buildings. So with that, I will hand it back over to Catherine.
Great. Thank you very much. We really only have time for maybe a couple of questions for Ben and Nellie as I put up the slides for Jody. We'll definitely get all the slides out to everybody so that you'll see the recommendation list again and go over that at the end.
It's like Jeff Hammer.
Hammerland.
Spell name Hammerland has a question. You're
Go ahead,
muted,
Jeff.
Jeff.
There we go. There we go. Okay, Jeff Hammerland here. So this is fascinating. I guess I have so many questions, but the most important one is, has the information that you folks have been imparting been available to the governor's task force advisory group? And if so, what kind of reaction have you received so far? I know there's some good people on that group.
Yeah. Yeah, I can speak to that one, Jeff.
Sure.
And Nellie can as well, obviously. So I shared a similar presentation to the advisory council. I was joined by Sam Diaz, the executive director of 1000 Friends of Oregon. Nellie gave comments there as well. And Department of Land Conservation Development also gave a presentation and a kind of a primer on land use. And so they received that. And I've since heard from the co-chairs that they're taking all that under advisement and they're getting to a point of recommending some guardrails and other environmental considerations for how data centers are sited in the future. So it is landing, but council, they're effectively they're advisory, right? So they make a recommendation, and then what that turns into, as far as policy in the 27 session and what the governor is interested in, um, time will tell. How about you, Nelly? What do you think?
I say make all the comments you can, get it on the record. I'm not highly optimistic.
And I think the only other comment I would make is that if you are available to attend those meetings, I was texting somebody who's one of the task force members. And, for those of us who, work, like I've worked in the water area before, and these people are, they have their own areas of expertise. And so they don't always know what questions to ask. So if you know anybody on the task force, text them. But definitely put in comments, and there's going to be a lot of potential legislation in the 2027 that it's going to be very good for us to educate our legislators about.
Well, I'll just mention that there's a class I'm involved with at Portland State University, and we had a session on the data centers 2 weeks ago. We had two of the members of the advisory group speak, and they were good people, very good people, but they had just come back from a tour in Eastern Oregon, and one of the comments that they made was they were surprised how much support they were getting in Eastern Oregon for these data centers, which was kind of different than what I'm hearing here. So it was interesting.
The rural areas tend to have more support because it has brought jobs. And in areas that have been very depressed, that has felt useful. But when you get to the point where you're not having an adequate amount of water, and you're going to start building even more, we're kind of at a break point for some of these areas. So I think we're going to move along. Jody Weiser is our next speaker. She is the founder of Tax Fairness Oregon, a very highly regarded organization that is all volunteer and evaluates tax policy bills and advocates for sound taxation policy. I knew Jody back when she was a kindergarten teacher, and she has really worked to develop this organization and her own knowledge around these issues. So I really appreciate her being here. Go ahead, Jody.
So I'm going to talk about taxes, and that's really it. I think that the main thing I want you to take away from this little bit is that we are currently more generous than any other state in the tax breaks that we're giving data centers. And if we get rid of the property tax breaks and even some of the others, we will still be more generous than other states. That's the critical thing. So we have four kinds of tax breaks. We have no sales tax. Most states, what they do is get rid of the sales tax on some of the things they buy. We have property tax breaks. We have infrastructure, the roads, the sewer, the water lines, all that stuff is getting paid for by the public rather than by the businesses. And we have income tax breaks, particularly in Eastern Oregon. So there are 39 states that have given data centers partial sales tax breaks. We are one of 5 states that gives them 100% sales tax breaks because we don't charge any sales tax on anything. Catherine, are you advancing these?
Yes. So the next one is up.
Right. So it's all goods and all services. So for instance, in Washington State, the electrical infrastructure and the servers and that kind of computer equipment, they don't pay sales tax on, but they do on everything else. In Oregon, they don't pay it on the cement for the buildings. They don't pay it on the equipment. They don't pay it on their electricity. Some of them give them tax breaks on electricity. We don't even charge them sales tax on the rug at the front door, the fence around that's securing the property. So Amazon's lobbyist told me during the February session that they've spent $39.3 billion in data centers in Eastern Oregon. Well, if we had the average sales tax in this country, they would have saved $3.3 billion on that investment. So we gave them $3 billion essentially that they would have paid someplace else. And that $3 billion is figured on about 7.75%, which is a national average for sales tax. It's higher in both California and Washington state. Then we have the property tax breaks for data centers. We have the 5-year standard enterprise zone. That's what's used in Hillsborough and Beaverton and Corvallis, Bend, wherever there are urban sites. And in fact, the first Amazon facility had a 5-year standard enterprise zone. With the legislation that passed during this last session, that's now a 3-year enterprise zone for the standard enterprise zone. They can't extend it for data centers. And there's also the moratorium, as you know. And if you've been following the news, you found out that it might be a 5-year limit, but they just keep giving you business one after another. As far as we know, no other enterprise zone sponsor ever has given anybody more than one enterprise zone subsidy. But the applications that just came in, one of them goes out to 2051, so 25 years forward of tax breaks. In the rural areas, they tend to use either the 15-year long-term rural enterprise zone or the 15-year strategic investment program, the SIP, the one that was designed for Intel originally. And so they negotiate a 15-year one, and Prineville is acting really happy that their first data centers are coming out of that 15-year period and will start paying taxes. Next slide. So that property tax exemption costs the local communities in Oregon $450 million this year. And of that 450 million, 150 is K-12 money. So because of the school funding formula, schools everywhere had less money because of the tax abatements that affected the local school funding. 90 million was in Hillsborough, and 360 million was in the central and northeastern part of the state. That number a year earlier was 330 million. So that's a big jump in a single year, 330 to 450 million. So how do we compare with our neighbors? That's probably the question. Data centers have mostly been on the coasts until recently, but now that they're going any place they can. So our neighbors are California. They have no property tax breaks for data centers. They have no sales tax breaks for data centers. They still have a few more data centers than we do, but of course they're 10 times our population. Washington State has no property tax breaks for data centers, and they have sales tax breaks on server equipment and power infrastructure, mostly just in the rural counties. And in the 26 legislation, they ended the tax break for replacement equipment. So they will pay sales tax. When they buy their new servers, they'll pay sales tax. The first time a company builds a facility, they wouldn't, but any replacement, they would. So if we disqualify data centers from Oregon property tax breaks, we will still be by far the best deal on the West Coast. And on top of that, we have a whole bunch of cables that come to Oregon, almost as many as go to California. And like they seem to come and go. So around 10 that come to the Oregon coast. Washington State has 2. Then there's the infrastructure costs for these facilities. If you drive out to Hillsborough and you get off the road at the Helvetia exit and you go south, you will see nothing, almost nothing but data centers to your right. There's roads that were built, data centers are on both sides of them. If homes were built there, when the home buyers bought their homes, they would pay for the land, all of that internal infrastructure, and their house. That's all in the price of the house. When industrial land is sold, usually the public pays instead of the businesses. So why they're treated differently is hard to understand. They do pay the same system development charges, but that's for infrastructure off your property, off the property that's being developed. And it used to be that when land was developed for industrial use, it was in the price of the land when it was sold, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. So the North Hillsborough industrial area is one of those areas where the public or all of the taxing jurisdictions are going to be paying for it. The district has been set up to spend almost $300 million for infrastructure. It will be repaid by diverting new property taxes. So when they do start paying taxes, it doesn't go to schools, counties. It goes to roads and water and sewer and the lights on their streets. So it will be decades before the district will be paid off and the businesses will start supporting the same things that their employees support when they pay their taxes. Why it's not included in the price of land when they purchase is because nobody's been pushing them. Nobody's been saying to their local communities, that's not okay. And in Hillsborough, they certainly haven't. I was at a meeting once at the county, and they have to approve these industrial renewal areas. And the county didn't even, they just passed it. They just voted yes. Let Wilsonville have a big, they call it urban renewal, industrial renewal, or SIP districts, not SIP, TIF districts. And it was over $200 million. And then a few days later, the county chair was complaining that they were short $7 million. And it was like, well, you just gave years of no property taxes coming from that industrial area, and you didn't even discuss it. And her response was, we try to be nice to our cities. Next slide. And then there's the income tax. These are, you all know about the businesses shifting their profits offshore. There's also in most rural counties, for the first time a business builds there, they get 10 years of paying no income taxes. And we don't get to know how much they don't pay. We did 1 year when one data center came in, and there were quite a few other businesses in the program. And that year, the cost of this abatement went from about $3 to about $15 million. So obviously, the data center had something to do with that. And then particularly in the areas like Hillsborough, Corvallis, Bend, et cetera, a lot of the data centers that are co-location data centers are actually owned either as real estate investment trusts or by pass-through organizations. So they pay no business level income tax. So we're not getting much money at all. Go ahead and change the slide. So the solutions that the legislature has been working on in 2025, they did the Power Act to try to stop cost shifting for future electrical infrastructure. I don't think anybody's talked about the fact that they've used up the excess infrastructure that we all paid for. And if they fail, we'll still be left with paying for their infrastructure. In 2026, the governor's House Bill 4084 changed the urban enterprise zone to 3 years and put in a moratorium for data centers. And if you've been following the news, Hillsborough just has pushed a whole bunch of agreements through, at least 17, but we don't know how many they might have pushed through before we started looking. So in 2027, if we end the property tax breaks, we will still be the best on the West Coast. I think we should also end the 10 years of income tax breaks, maybe not for all businesses, but certainly for data centers. And there's new ones going to Eastern Oregon right now, simply just built recently. We should fix taxation of global income. These organizations, the big tech guys, they hide money offshore like crazy. And we should require them to pay their own infrastructure costs. And then probably not in 27, but at some point, we should look for a new way to tax them since they're really not paying much in income taxes. We should find a way to tax them on something that we can measure, like how much energy they use, how much water they use. So those are the solutions that we see as the right way to move forward on the tax side of data centers.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jody. And I'm sure people will have some questions on that. But it was really a huge win to get that only 1 year moratorium on the exemptions for new data centers applying in enterprise zones for the property tax exemption. And everybody voted for it in the committee except for Senator Solman from Hillsborough, including the Republicans. So our next speaker is Jim Schertzinger, an economist by background, who volunteers as well with Tax Fairness Oregon. I will only mention the highlights of his varied career. He retired as the Chief Operations Officer at the Oregon Department of Human Services in 2016, where he served for 5 years, and previous to that was the Chief Financial Officer of DHS for 5 years. Prior to that, he served 20 years, of which 14 were as director in the Legislative Revenue Office, a nonpartisan office in the Oregon legislature that is the staff to the House and Senate Revenue and School Finance committees. He's a senior fellow of the American Leadership Forum of Oregon and serves on the Healthy Democracy Board. Thanks so much for joining us, Jim.
Thank you. I am an economist. I apologize for that. And I may say some things that give you a good reason to make me apologize. Let's see. There are really two questions I've been hearing about data centers. And one is that are economic benefits greater than the cost? That's probably the most frequent question. And it's a natural question. We're making this investment. Are we getting something of value for what we paid for? And the second one is related to that. Are we paying more for the benefits than we need to? Now, this is a different question than the first one. Another way of asking it is to say that would the benefits occur without the tax breaks? After all, there's lots of economic activity that take place in Oregon. People aren't getting tax breaks for that. And there are public benefits from that. And so why are we giving a tax break and even just comparing it to whatever the benefits might flow from that when that's the normal working of the economy? That actually is a subset of a bigger question, which is, are we maximizing the public benefit that we get from our tax policy and the incentives that we give for economic development? So those are the questions. Here's my response, at least initially. Well, first of all, in this area, in the area of data centers, no one has really adequately studied either question. You'll hear a lot of statistics, and there are actually some. There's a transparency website that largely deals with the urban districts, where they have a lot of information about how much the the tax benefits cost, or even how many jobs that are created in those particular places. Uh, but there really is nothing that adequately studies either of these two questions. And my second response, and these are the two things I would like to get through to the end to at the end of this, is that if we did, it would say a lot about how we go about pursuing economic development. In other words, these data centers is a classic example of what not to do and how should we do economic development better. So let's go to the next one. First of all, I want to recognize that there are benefits to data centers, and you've talked about some of them. Construction jobs, there's some ongoing or permanent jobs, not as many as you would get in other industries, but still there are some. Sometimes they make contributions to local services, and in some areas, especially in Eastern Oregon, a notable increase in economic activities. And so they have, especially in the early years when there's a lot of construction going on, because I think that's the biggest jobs that they actually create. Of course, they are gone after the project is built. But I think it's important to recognize that there are benefits. You can go to the next one. But there are also costs. And here is a list. I kind of asked Catherine to come up with a list of, and here are many of the kinds of things that you've already heard tonight. Increasing costs for electricity, the system demands, the cost of peak demand, of new power generation. We're not meeting our climate targets, the water demand, the wastewater management, noise pollution, air pollution, um, loss of funding to entice higher benefit industry. This is a kind of a subset of that second question, which says that uh, if you devote your land to this kind of operation, that means you can't use it for something else, which might be of higher value. And then finally on that list, the impact on other jurisdictions. So recognizing that if we attract more people or more activity to Oregon, it has costs to it. We have to pay for education. The local fire department has to upgrade its services because they have risks in these data centers that you don't have in other buildings, and that sort of thing. And so all of those things are costs. So it's recognizing that. So let's see what kind of evaluation we do in Oregon of data centers and of the enterprise zone in general. The whole notion of an enterprise, the whole exemption for enterprise zone, which extends beyond data centers. Well, there really are two. One is a law that requires an evaluation of all tax expenditures. And the evaluation is intended to ask the question, is it achieving the purpose of the expenditure? And I would recommend, this is about 5 pages in the tax expenditure report that comes out every 2 years about enterprise zones, and explains what they are. It has estimates of the cost of the exemption that we give. They tend to be underestimated right now because it's not keeping up with the growth, but it still comes out to be a substantial amount of money. And uh, and so I think it's a good primer on the way the enterprise zone works and how much money is involved. And it's also a good way of getting to the mindset of how people are evaluating it. So I would recommend that. The other study that's out there is more comprehensive in some ways and is often cited in the debate around data centers is the property tax incentives impact study that was done by Business Oregon. And it measures what they call a return on investment. Um, and and let's talk a little bit about what that return on investment means. This is an 81-page study. It gets and I think actually in many ways well done. It's thorough, but what it's actually measuring is this: the cost of the exemption, or the cost that they're talking about in the study, is the lost revenue from the exemption. That's it. There's no other costs. The benefit they measure is the increase in direct and induced economic activity. Sometimes that's called an economic impact, or how much more business is generated by this cost. Well, what they're really doing here is they're using sort of cost benefit analysis to do a study, and using terms that it's not a cost. They're using terms that are used in cost benefit analysis, but they're not really doing a cost benefit analysis. And one of the ways of understanding that is if you were to look back at the benefits that I listed earlier in the report, and you looked at the costs that were listed, they've got all the benefits in the study, but they really only have one cost: the lost value of the exemption. And so this is not in any sense a cost benefit study at all. It's simply an impact study. You actually should go a little even deeper than that in what it's not, is that some people would say, well, that means all it's really looking is the economic effects. And that really isn't true either, because they're not even including a lot of economic costs in the cost side. Land has value. Water has value. They're not considering the value of those things when they compare the costs against the benefits. And that's what a normal economic study would do, even if it ignored all the external effects. So, but I did want to pull up one table out of this report. And so remember, this is they're doing this return on investment, where the cost is the value of the exemptions they're getting, and compare it to the amount of economic activity that occurred after they got it, as it's what they judge from the result of that exemption that they got. This particular table is one that shows that impact under that kind of analysis by industry. And in this particular case, data centers are in the information industry. That's where they are in the national standards. When you fill out your income tax form and you tell them what business you're in, they're in the information business. And even by the very limited and flawed analysis they're doing, information generates and this is across all of the enterprise information businesses within the enterprise zones that got that benefit, generated about $2 of economic activity for every dollar of investment. If you could, in other words, if you would put your money into almost any other industry, you would get a lot more economic activity. And the reason for that, they even say it in the report, is that it produces relatively few jobs compared to almost any other investment. So even with this kind of flawed analysis, it's not even a good economic cost benefit analysis. It in the sense that it's not it's just not a cost benefit analysis at all, and it doesn't take into these external effects. It still looks like a bad investment compared to other things you might want to invest in. Um, so um, when you look at the situation at the cost, and you start looking at these numbers, and the conclusion I think you very quickly get to is that if we really did a true study, it would very clearly show that the public costs exceeded the benefits of this kind of exemption. And secondly, in most places, these facilities would have been built anyway. The numbers, the overwhelming demand for these services, and the other benefit, the other incentive, not even incentives, the other qualities of Oregon, their lower power costs, the fiber optic cables that are here, the water supply that we have, uh, are attractive enough that that these things would have been built anyway. And the evidence for that, you already heard that the data center companies that are involved are willing to pay high prices for land and for anything that can really help them get a permit to build these data centers. And we've created that part of that demand by giving them these huge tax breaks. Um, and and so the bottom line is that we got some benefit out of this, but we massively overpaid for them. And the evidence that's already there is enough to say we should just end it. We should end this benefit. I guess that might be good enough for many people, but I think we really should examine further why this happened and what is it that caused this to happen? And I think our whole approach to economic development is fundamentally flawed. And it's fundamentally flawed because it creates a system that produces the results we got. I mean, yes, there may be some bad actors involved here, but this system is, when you set up a system like that, it's going to produce this result. One of the things about the enterprise zone approach is that it encourages meeting minimum standards. The legislature sets out in law the standards for what makes you eligible for an enterprise zone. And then we set out administrators that administer it. And what they do is they determine whether you're eligible or not. And once you meet the minimum standards, you're in. And so what that encourages is for the reason we set these things up in the first place is to try to attract attractive businesses that produce a lot of jobs, but we then set minimum standards, and anybody that meets them gets in, and the ones that it attracts those people that just barely meet the minimums because everybody else is after the the ones that that have a lot of economic benefit, and we only get, if we don't aggressively go after those, then we get the ones that meet the minimums. The second thing is it rewards administrators for creating economic activity rather than creating public benefit. That's what they're measuring. That's what you're going to get. And there really is no sense in 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 how the thing is administered to really make a judgment about how much public benefit we're getting out of this. It's essentially a marketing process. Uh, there's a lot of pressure to develop land. If the desired users, the ones that we're looking to come to Oregon, are slow to come, and the land is, we subsidize the creation of industrial land, and if we don't get immediately those that we really desire to get or might desire to get, there's a lot of pressure to develop it. Um, One good example of something we might do instead is that California replaced their enterprise zones with a competitive credit, one that really incentivized giving credits to people who could show that they maximize public benefits in the process, as opposing to just meeting a minimum standard. So I really think that if we really looked in detail on how this happened, we recognizing that we got to a bad result and looked at why that happened, we would change the whole approach that we use. Anyway, that's the
Thanks, Jim. That's really clear. And I think, we can see that in terms of the numbers that Jody showed as well. So we are a little short in terms of time on what to do at this point. So we will have one more webinar. We do encourage people to, especially, around the elections. We had our election, but, we're going to be going into the November, is asking local candidates and elected officials, what do they think about data centers and what are they interested in doing about it? Asking for meetings with them locally, since as Ben and Nellie both indicate, it's the city and the counties that are working these programs to make the siting of data centers happen. So ask for some of the following: environmental impact assessments, that we should have a moratorium for building any data centers until there is environmental impact evaluations done in those particular areas. How much industrial land is available in the area, and could it be used for better purposes? Another aspect of requirements is that you can have local jurisdictions say, well, you're going to have to tell us exactly what your power use is, what amount of land you need, what kind of jobs you're going to produce, and how you're going to manage pollution. We can also set up that we require them to develop their own renewable energy production, or other policies that push us in that direction. And then, of course, stopping tax breaks for data centers. Really the same thing at the state. I think more of the actions are happening at the state, but I know that there's Jody alluded to some local actions that have been taken to remove some of these tax breaks at the local level. But getting involved with the governor's task force, sending a letter to her and to your state elected officials, asking for a permanent moratorium on tax breaks for data centers, asking for a rigorous evaluation of the costs and benefits, policies to require environmental impact assessments and transparency for data centers along these lines. MCAT, Tax Fairness Oregon, Central Oregon Land Watch are three of organizations, among others, that will be working on these issues. So reaching out to one of these organizations and asking for more information, getting input on setting up these meetings, or even having one of us join you for those meetings would be fantastic. So the links are all listed here. The emails for the people who spoke today are listed in the slides as well, and other resources if you want to read in more depth. And I strongly recommend the Oregon's Governor's Task Force linked here. And they haven't talked about taxation yet, but their April meeting went through the land use issues. So I wanted to make sure that we finished on time. I think that Um, there are a lot of excellent questions in the chat. If some of the other folks want to try and answer some of those. Or we will take some of these questions and put some answers to them and send it out when we send out the slides and the recording.
I did do the chat, Drew.
All right. I'm not seeing any hands raised or people.
Virginia has her
Virginia, I'm sorry. I'm on the wrong page.
No, not on mute.
Hi, can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I publish Cedar Mill News, and it goes out to about 8,000 people in Northeast Washington County. And I've been sort of, covering my eyes about this because it's complicated, but I'm intending to put an article in the June issue. And so if anybody wants to reach out to me to help me write this article, you can send an email to info@cedarmillnews.com, and I'll put that in the chat. If anybody has any comments, let me know. But my focus is usually on, number one, how does it affect you, my neighbor? And number two, what you can do about it. So that will be my focus, and I'd appreciate any input that anybody has.
Jürgen Hess here. The problem with having these folks generate their own power is it goes to nuclear. I was on the Oregon Nuclear Safety Board, and there's all kinds of proposals over there at Hanford for doing this very thing. We don't need more nuclear stuff.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that, Bruce, and Susan. But we certainly can, request solar panels and
Yeah.
investment in community wind and those kinds of activities.
Yes.
So I totally agree with you. Alan, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, well, my comment is what I just dropped into the chat, and I'm working on this with the Jackson County Democratic Party. I'm trying to get a resolution passed through the Jackson County Democratic Party to urge the state to put a moratorium on data center certification until all of these questions are answered. The energy, the water, the land use, and the whole tax incentive boondoggle. Because this is bonkers.
Yes, I agree. I think that is certainly one way to go. It will be very difficult to push, but the more of us that are interested and concerned and raising the issues with, real evidence of what some of the limitations are. I think in Eastern Oregon, for example, in the Dells, they got investments for increasing water and a mechanism to store it. But that and the Google helped pay for them.
Then I'll be ready pretty soon.
But there are certainly a lot of these organizations that had previously stated that they were going to create their own renewable energy, and they're not. So there's a lot of different avenues like that to think about as well. Theodora raised the issue of livability of residential areas nearby. That certainly is an issue for the noise. And the backup generation energy is usually diesel or could be propane. That causes a lot of local air pollution, and we'll cover that in the next webinar. Cindy?
Thank you, and thank you very much for this presentation. Just a quick question. Um, do you know if there's been any look at the siting provisions for energy facilities and how they may relate to data centers in terms of the standards that must be met?
I think the siting for energy goes through a different process than the local processes because it is depends on whether it's on state land or federal land. So there's
Actually,
a couple of different certifications.
yeah, actually, and I think it's by size. It's over a certain size that goes to the state, under a certain size can go through the county process. And I'm just wondering if there's been, you know, any look at that, because, there are water issues looked at, wildlife, environmental, noise, many of the things brought up here today.
Right. And yeah. And I don't know if Nellie is still on the call, if she has any thoughts on that.
Okay, I'll pursue another way. Yeah.
Yeah, sounds
Thank you.
good.
Thank you.
Mark?
Yeah, I had asked a question in the chat, but as far as the building, the construction of the data centers, do they hire local workers to construct it, or even in Oregon? And if so, do they hire a union? So I'm curious to see if anybody has answers to those questions. And I'm not talking about the permanent jobs, I'm talking about actually constructing it.
Right. Josie?
Now, according to the, I've been listening into the advisory committee, and according to what I've heard, they are union jobs, and there's a training, special training that is offered in Washington. Because they're highly specialized jobs. They're not something that some unions from Texas can do. You really have to be trained in this particular type of data center development construction. So yes, they are union jobs mostly.
And the other jobs that I heard the mayor of Prineville talk about is that every 3 years or so, they swap out all of these servers, these racks and racks of machines, and the electricians are needed then. So, there's a certain cycle, which is, probably a boom and bust kind of thing, but there's a cycle that if the electricians are there and they keep going through each of these data centers, and there's more than one, then they can maintain a job even though they're considered temporary workers. But at a certain point, if the company goes belly up, or one company's AI wins out over everybody else's AI, then you have that bust cycle where the amount of electricians in a particular area are not needed as any longer. Sarah?
Yeah, just on the jobs thing. My husband's in the construction industry and has worked on data centers. It depends, like as far as the locality, like yes, it is union. Whether they're or not they're local jobs, it depends. So like here in Hillsborough, like we live in Hillsborough, he commutes 5 minutes to work, but he has also had to commute to the Dalles when the Dalles was building stuff, and so technically like not local. So if it's a rural job site, you will probably be seeing workers come in from other states, other cities, setting up fifth wheels, trailers, trying to get rent local apartments to work in those spaces. That's what's happening in Boise right now. A lot of Oregon electricians are going to Boise right now to work out there, and they're not planning on staying kind of thing. So it's a mixed situation depending on where it is.
Mm. Well, thank
Thank
you.
you. Other comments or questions?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I have done a lot of reading. I was the one that was mentioning the transmission lines, and there is a totally different type of heavy capacity transmission lines. So far, China and Brazil are the only ones that have it. But it's a big deal for how far the hyperscalers have to get, the electricity from data centers over to where it's needed. And I've yet to find any kind of information where people are researching and investing in just the basic infrastructure of us rebuilding the transmission lines we need for the high capacity of AI.
Yeah, that's definitely huge. I mean, we're having a hard time with the transmission lines not being able to take all the wind energy, for example, already, not even necessarily for the data centers. Um, and a lot of the capacity is calculated based on needing to be able to meet peak demand, when in reality, we typically are at the 40% of demand level. So there's a variety of mechanisms, but data centers need the electricity 24/7, which is why they pull in backup generation, because if they're asked to diminish their demand, they have to have backup to make sure that things are still working.
Yes, absolutely. And I just don't hear a lot of conversations about that. When I watch shows that's got the hyperscalers on it and they're talking about this competitive rush, why they all need to have their data centers, it's a competitive rush because they're just trying to grab as much venture capital. And so you've got all these different tech elites that are trying to get as many slices of the venture capital pie as there is. So it's not, I mean, I don't want to act like an expert or whatever, but what I'm just saying is it's not so much that we are at the point to be in this much of a rush to just throw up these expensive data centers so fast, but it's because they are trying to grab the venture capital before one of their competitors grabs it.
Yeah. So the governor's task force, their next meeting is a week from tomorrow, May 29th, and that will be on energy. They meet the last Friday of the month, and in June they'll be talking about affordability and taxation. And then the final meeting in July will be a discussion and deliberation of a draft report that they've done. Each of these sessions has a summary, because I know it's really hard to sit there and listen to 6 hours of presentations and discussion. But there is a summary for each one that has been posted on the ones that have already been held, just to let people know that.
Is there any way we can get on a mailing list so we can get access to this material? We can do research on it?
I will be sending out the slides, and I
you.
will be sending out, which has the link to the governor's task force. And I will be sending out the recording, so feel free to share.
And the upcoming meetings, how can we get on that mailing list?
I will email everybody who has already joined one of the previous meetings.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Last word, Virginia?
All the previous task force recording or meetings are also recorded and available on their website.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was across the room and I had to run over and turn on my stuff. I was just going to mention that I published a little bit of information that PGE was closing US 26 for a little while so they could run a power line across there to the data center area. And then just recently, PGE claimed that they were going to charge a different rate for data centers. So I don't know if this is greenwashing, but the cost to ratepayers of what they've been doing, I mean, everything up until now, I guess we pay for. And whether the data centers are going to be charged the proper amount based on their impact is another open question.
Well, we did pass a bill And we want to thank Senator Confam for making sure the Power Act made it through the session, which says that they have to pay for the transmission, the extra transmission and infrastructure that's needed for the demand, and not and to create a separate class for data centers. Of course,
Correct.
PGE, and that's only the well, it's primarily the PGE and Pacific Power. And they've been pushing back on that. Oh, well, we can do that for 3 years, but after then everybody's going to have to pay. So it's still being discussed at the Public Utility Commission, and we'll hear much more about that next month.
Yep.
Great. I mean,
So-
that won't do anything for the impact that's already happened. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. And
Well, and the Public Utility Commission did clarify that they had to do that. That was the recent decision. So, and it's at least some good news there.
thanks, Jeff. All righty. Well, thank you all for joining us. You'll get information from this presentation and an invitation to the next one as soon as we schedule it. So I appreciate your concerns and involvement in working hard to protect our Oregon land and electricity and climate.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.